Hi everyone, welcome. Just to give you a 3-minute warning, the event will start in a few minutes, but great to see you. Hello everyone, welcome to day 4 of Known. Crazy, cannot believe we're already at Thursday, but it is great to see you here, and a huge welcome to you guys on the live stream. How awesome that you can be with us as well. So I'm Lily. I'm honored to be your lunchtime host for Known this week. I'm a second year at St. Anne's doing Portuguese and linguistics, and I've been doing like a few random facts about me every day, and so today the train still doesn't stop. What was I going to say? My favorite drink is a G&T. I love a gin and tonic. I really don't like beer. We'll come back to that later. Out of my siblings, I have 3 younger siblings, but I am almost the shortest of all of them. Like, all but the youngest one has overtaken me in height, which causes severe identity crises every day. But you know, obviously, who my favorite sibling, therefore, is. No, I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. I'm definitely not kidding. And finally, I sing all the time, like all the time. Like the other day, I was falling asleep, and I woke myself up by singing out loud. Like, That's not normal. If anyone else has had anything like that, please let me know. I need to know I'm not alone, but that is not a normal occurrence. Anyway, on to way more exciting things. Whatever has brought you here today, whether it was the intrigue of the talk topic, a very excited friend, or the promise of free G&D's ice cream, you're in for an absolute treat. The lineup is a talk from the wonderful Kaz Dodds, followed by a Q&A. And just to say as well, if you have other commitments, feel free to slip out at any point, like if you need to be somewhere at 2, but we will aim to be finished by 2. Back to this Q&A, we have a very cool Slido vibe thing, I believe, which will appear in a moment. So you can send your questions throughout the event and throughout the talk, and it is completely anonymous, so feel free to send absolutely anything, and we'll discuss those at the end with Kaz. I don't know if the Slido thing, there's a link which will wonderfully appear in a moment. Fill time. But yeah, so we've got a great lineup, and sadly though, coronavirus is still a thing. So for you guys who are in the building, please do keep your masks on for the whole event and stay seated at the end, and our stewards will help guide you out and show you out. Anyway, without much further ado, I'd love to welcome Kaz up to the stage. Great to have you with us today, Kaz. Now, throughout this week, we've learnt that Kaz and I are quite different in terms of opinions on small things.
I mean, you are fascinating, Lily, frankly. I think that's what I've learned. You're just a very interesting person. But carry on. What are you going to say?
Thank you. I'll take that. I did not tell her to say that, so thank you very much. But it seems that I have very strong opinions on very little things, whereas Kaz wisely reserves sort of strength of opinion for things that matter a lot more.
Yeah.
Which is very fair.
You've summed me up quite well there, I think.
Yeah. So apparently scones doesn't merit a strong opinion, which is quite hard for me to swallow, but that's fine. Also, yeah, the Slido link is there now, so do scan that or take a photo and send your questions in as they pop up. However, I did mention to Kaz earlier on about what is your favorite drink? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, you didn't say it like that.
Oh dear.
So I would, because I don't like questions like that, because again, it depends on the situation.
Okay.
Yeah, depends on the situation.
Rephrase?
If the situation is like a G&T or something situation, I would take a G&T. I'd probably like choose a pint.
I see, okay.
If I had the option, but I would, if anyone wants to give me a gin and tonic, that's fine too.
There you go. Yeah, the question, I guess the way I phrased it earlier on was, do you like beer? Which is a much more controversial topic in my opinion, because I think beer is quite disgusting. Kaz likes it, so bit of an icon. Anyway, tell us a bit about yourself and where you're from and why you're here.
Sure. See, those sorts of things I think are interesting. They are worth answering. It's lovely to be here with you. My name is Kaz. I'm from Edinburgh. I grew up there, but after university I moved to Glasgow, lived there for about 10 years, and recently have moved back to Edinburgh. Do a number of different things in a normal week. The main thing is I look after my twins who are 4, Ada and Izzy. I also work part-time at Scottish Government, and at the moment I'm on holiday with you guys, asking some of life's biggest questions, and I just love doing things like this. Partly because these sorts of questions were really significant for me in my own life. As a teenager, my final year of school, first year of university, I became quite dissatisfied with the kind of worldview that I suppose, just grown up assuming was true, which was a kind of agnostic atheism. I felt quite dissatisfied with that and started to ask some of the questions that we're exploring this week. So they're questions that have had a really kind of personal impact on me. And so this is why I like to take about a week's holiday a year to get to discuss these questions with students today. So I'm totally fascinated to know your thoughts on it too. So do please send in your questions or stick up your hands at the end. I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on these subjects as well. But that's me. And I need a haircut. That's what I've discovered about myself this week. I made the mistake of looking on YouTube just to see if I could get any feedback for myself from the talks. And my summary is I need a haircut. So.
Incredible. But yes, so a much bigger question than the question of scones is is there meaning in our pain? Which I'm going to hand straight over to Kaz to hear about that.
Great, thanks, Lily. And you're right, this is an enormous question. And I said that I really enjoy doing talks like this. I suppose it's something I do in my spare time. It's not a job, something I really enjoy doing and think there's a huge amount of value in. But I'll be honest with you and say that this particular talk on the issue of pain and suffering is actually my least favorite. I'll level with you on that it's not a subject that I really enjoy talking about. I think it's a really important one to address. And in particular, when we're thinking about Christianity and the claims it makes, this issue of pain and suffering is so important to discuss. But it's not one I love discussing. And that's really because, why is it? Well, it's because it's sad. It brings up all sorts of things that are sad, that aren't nice to think about. I like thinking about happy things. That's something about me. I like thinking about happy things on the whole. I laugh quite a lot. And when we discuss issues of pain and suffering, inevitably that leads us to thinking about really sad things, which isn't fun, and yet I think is really important, and as well I think prepares us for life really well in a way that we don't find opportunity really in lots of life. You know, some of the kind of key things, kind of the key moments in our life will be things that are profoundly difficult or painful. And yet I don't think there's many opportunities to talk about them. Big issues we don't really talk about. I feel very lucky. I consider myself to be fairly well educated. I went to a good school. I went to a good university. At the time, I think it was actually ranked higher than Oxford in the league tables. I've got 2 degrees. I consider myself to have been lucky to have had a good education, and yet none of that's prepared me for a very common experience in life, which is experiencing pain and suffering. None of that prepared me to be at the funeral of a school friend, a kind of profoundly important moment in my life, when I was standing at the funeral of a school friend, and we looked at each other, me and my school friends, and agreed that nothing had prepared us for this. We don't tend to talk about those sorts of things very much as a culture, and yet they are things that we will face all the time. The last time I kind of publicly gave a talk like this on this subject was over a year ago. It was in February last year, and I started by talking about how 2019 had been a really difficult year for many of my friends. I had a friend whose dad died, another friend who suffered a miscarriage. It might be the kind of stage of life that I'm at, but another friend had a related sadness where her 3rd child was born with a rare condition that meant that he only lived for an hour. Those sorts of sadnesses sort of defined 2019 for me. And so all of us, we had a bit of a joke about 2020. 2020 was going to be the year where things kind of looked up and got better. Lol. And then in March, the global pandemic hit. And of course, those kind of everyday sadnesses didn't go away, but they were kind of compounded by the fact that we couldn't be with one another through them. It was even harder. And of course, the sadness of the awful death toll of coronavirus. 2020 didn't really deliver on its promises. I think my university years, looking back, were actually probably some of my happiest, and yet I know that for many of you, you will be going through very difficult and painful things at the moment. Because suffering is ubiquitous, isn't it? It's on our newspapers, it's in our text messages, in our 3 a.m. can't get to sleeps, it's in our breakups, it's every day, it's part of life. I loved The Good Place. Did anyone watch that series? It was out, The Good Place. The kind of premise is, well, it's interesting because it is one place that series did talk about death, didn't it? It kind of faced it head on and made it into a comedy. Brilliant. But the kind of premise of it is that the 4 main characters have died and ended up in the afterlife. And at one point in it that I want to share with you, Eleanor, the lead character who's played by Kristen Bell, she's trying to explain to someone who isn't a human what it's like to be human. And he freaks out, cannot cope with it, the things that she's described about being human. And then this little exchange takes place. So Eleanor says to Michael, do you know what's really happening right now? You're learning what it's like to be human. All humans are aware of death. So we're all a little bit sad all the time. That's just the deal. Michael replies, sounds like a crappy deal. Well, yeah, it is. But we don't get offered any other ones. And if you try and ignore your sadness, it just ends up leaking out of you anyway. We can't ignore our sadness. Isn't that right? And the experience of these last couple of years, I think in particular for me, has really made me reflect on the different ways that we think about our suffering. Where do we go with our pain? What do we do with it? And importantly, where will I get the resources to be able to support other people who are in pain and who are suffering? So today, really what I'm going to do for our remaining time is just try to explore two different questions. The first is, what's our experience of pain, and what way of viewing the world explains that? So what's our experience of pain, and what way of viewing the world explains it? And secondly, the difference that the person of Jesus makes to that. So our experience of pain and suffering. I wonder what sprang to your mind as I kind of listed the things that me and my friends have struggled with over the last couple of years. Perhaps you felt sympathy, empathy. I think for most of us who are experiencing pain, the thing that we tend to do is ask, why? Why is this happening? Instinctively, we know that it's not the way it should be, don't we? We ask, why? Jess Glynn sings this, oh, drowning in the darkest grey. That's what it's like sometimes, isn't it? Drowning with no answers to rescue me. So tell me, why me? I didn't even know. Why me? I would say that's a very common response to suffering. I think we're familiar with that question, that why, because we long for there to be a meaning in our pain, don't we? We long for it not to be in vain. And we can cope with most things if there is a big enough why, can't we? So I held my baby as I let a health professional stab them in the thigh because I knew a why that was big enough, that getting all of the horrible diseases that vaccination would stop would be more painful than the pain of a vaccination itself. The why was big enough. Or to take a step back, think childbirth. The why is big enough to cope with the pain and the suffering. It was psychologist Viktor Frankl who said, those who have a why to live for can bear almost any how. Because pain is out of step with instinctively how we know things should be. It shows us that something is wrong. It's a problem. We don't notice really feeling well, do we? Maybe when you get better from a horrible illness, you think when you're suffering, you think, when I'm well, I'm going to really notice it. I'm not going to take it for granted. But most of the time, our default, things are going fine, we don't notice. But pain we do. We ask why. And so what worldview kind of explains that response? Because according to some ways of viewing the world, asking why is really nonsense. I think it's really important to read authors that you disagree with. I think that's generally quite a good principle, to try to inform yourself, to read people you don't necessarily agree with. And a few years ago, I read the memoir of Christopher Hitchin, who was a prolific journalist, writer, and atheist. And he was very outspoken in his cause. And his memoir, Mortality, was written as he battled cancer, as he was dying from cancer. I think it was unfinished. I think it was maybe, I don't know who published it. Anyway. And he writes this about that battle, that experience of battling cancer and the pain that he went through. He writes this, to the dumb question, why me? The cosmos barely bothers to return the reply, why not? I think that is an honest and very brave outworking of his much-loved way of viewing the world. That was that we live in a godless universe, that there isn't a God, and that the only reality is the material, physical world. If that is true, if he did get things right, and there is no God, no creator, therefore no design for human life, there is no way things should be, is there? Our suffering isn't morally wrong. It isn't a deviation from what ought to be, it just is. If all that's out there is material like us, well, that material won't even bother with the response. Why not? Primo Levi was a Jewish man who was taken to Auschwitz in 1944. After he was tattooed with a number, he was shut in a barrack with other Italian prisoners. And driven by thirst, he writes about opening a window and reaching out to get an icicle outside. And he writes this: "I opened the window and broke off the icicle, but at once a large, heavy guard prowling outside brutally snatched it away." "Why?" I asked in my poor German. "Here, there is no why," he replied, shoving me back inside. Reading those two accounts together, Christopher Hitchin, "Why not?" and Primo Levi, "Here there is no why," I thought, really, is that the world that we live in? Are we living in that world? Here there is no why. I think it's a strange thing, isn't it, that even though lots of us don't believe in God, don't think that there is a kind of cosmic plan, a way things should be, we still respond to suffering the same way, don't we? We still say, why? When we experience physical pain, it is a sign that something is wrong, isn't it? To ignore it, to say, well, don't ask why, would be silly. It would mean that we wouldn't know how to figure out how to get better. And I think the same is true of our emotional or our moral suffering, that actually, even as we question it, as we rage against it, that reaction is a sign that something is wrong, which means there is a standard that is right. There is a way things should be. There is a moral, non-physical reality that exists. And so, of course, it feels inhumane, doesn't it, in the face of breakups, regrets, bereavements, all sorts of pain, to not be able to ask why. Are we happy with saying that that's the way the world is? Here there is no why. I think that question is a good teacher to us, that our response to pain and to suffering teaches us that essentially we do believe in the ultimate goodness of reality, that a deviation from that is a problem. I think we do. It shows us that we do believe in the ultimate goodness of reality, and that we are experiencing a world that is broken, that is out of kilter, that isn't everything that it was made to be. And I think we long for our own personal stories of pain to be anchored in something bigger, something that can make sense somehow of it. Could it be that, like a lighthouse on the rocks, our asking why, our experiencing the problem of pain is the sign that there is something more, that there is something more meaningful, which we're all really building our lives on. And I think that's why many who are in the midst of pain, not necessarily looking at this from a purely kind of academic, intellectual, or philosophical problem kind of way, for many who are in pain, the person of Jesus is just hugely compelling because they find someone who can cope with their why. I mentioned one of my best friends whose dad died a couple of years ago, and before his funeral, she's not a Christian. I think it was a humanist funeral, and so they didn't sing hymns at it. But it's really striking. Before his funeral, she said to me, "I know it's hypocritical. I don't believe Christianity is true, but I want to sing a hymn. I just want to sing a hymn." And I think she needed something that could carry the weight of the grief that she felt that actually we don't find many sources for in our secular culture. Because here there is no why. Whereas Christianity, I think, gives us a story that acknowledges that why. I think it can carry the weight. I think it lets us shout, this is not the way things are supposed to be. Far from being evidence against God, I want to say that our experience of pain is best explained from our worldview where there is a God. It's best explained from a Christian worldview. But I don't want to stop there because I think the truth is even better than that. It isn't just that there is a God who is some distant deity proven through philosophical reasoning. No, I think the evidence shows us that God came in human history to share in human suffering. And in this kind of second section, what I want to do is just look at an account of Jesus' life, a little section of this book, John's account of Jesus' life. There'll be one on a chair near you, or it'll come up on the screen. This is a different version, so I just need to orient myself in here. I'm going to be looking on page 30. So you might want to open up one of these for yourself to page 30. Otherwise, it'll come up on the screen. And the background to this is that we're seeing here something very human, as I've discussed. We're seeing a funeral. Someone's died, a man named Lazarus, whose sisters, Mary and Martha, are friends of Jesus. And they knew that Jesus had been healing people, that he had been doing amazing things, and thought that Jesus would do that for his brother, but he didn't. And Lazarus, their brother, died. And I want to pick up the story at page 30 and the little number 32, just at the top of page 30. So this is John chapter 11 at 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. I'll pause there. Two amazing phrases there. Jesus wept, which is probably familiar. You might know very little of the Bible, yet you may well know that phrase. But a phrase before that really stood out to me. "Come and see," they replied. I said on Monday that Christianity essentially invites us to come and see, that I think it stands up to scrutiny, that I think that you can investigate it and test it and explore it, and that that's a good thing to do. But it really struck me as I was reading that here some grieving friends are inviting Jesus, inviting God to come and see their grief, to witness their sadness, to see the brokenness that they're experiencing. And the Son of God enters into the grief of his friends. He weeps. The Son of God who calmed storms, whose voice was powerful enough to do that, whose voice made the stars, according to Christianity, cries at the grave of a friend. He too raged against the awfulness of death. And I think that says something very profound to those of us who are suffering today, that Jesus shows us a God who is close to the brokenhearted. In the midst of pain and suffering, the knowledge that God sees and cares and is present brings countless people around the world today huge comfort. Not only does this show us Jesus, the God who grieves, but also the God who himself suffers. Uniquely in the world's religions, the very heart of Christianity is the God who loves us enough to suffer for us. The Christian claim is that on the cross, Jesus takes the suffering that would be ours, the consequences of our rebellion. He takes the consequences of that on himself. The Son of God himself suffers and dies. And so he not only cares for you, He understands that suffering too. I think that is unique and incredible, and yet it isn't the end. The story goes on. And so I just want to look down at the next little part of the story from the number 38 on page 30. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there for 4 days." And then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took the stone away. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." See, Jesus doesn't just walk alongside us in our suffering. He gives us the ultimate hope that we need in it and through it. We come up with all sorts of bonkers silver linings to our suffering, don't we? That it makes us stronger or that it strengthens our character. Ultimately, what we really need is for it to be made right. We need sadnesses like death to be undone. What we really need is to see our loved ones again. We need a hope that lasts beyond death. And that's what we see here as Jesus shows that he is even the one who can give hope beyond death. I know, that is bonkers, isn't it? Dead people don't rise from the dead, I know. And yet here is one whose voice is powerful enough to undo even the greatest sadness, rebellion, and brokenness in our world. The one who came to conquer our greatest enemy, death. I think that is so unusual that it is worth spending a whole talk just looking at that issue of the resurrection, which I'm going to do tomorrow. So please do come back if you, like me, or someone who's quite skeptical, come back tomorrow, and I want to discuss with you more about why I believe that to be true. But what I want us to see today is the impact of that. That Jesus does for Lazarus here what he says he will do for all of creation and all who trust in him, and that is give life even after death. That is the heart of what Christians believe. And really, our hope stands or falls on that issue. If it happened, there is hope. There is hope that my suffering isn't in vain, that my loved ones aren't lost forever. If it isn't true, if he didn't rise from the dead, if Jesus doesn't have that kind of power, well then death wins. The end of life is death. Here there is no why. Of course, for Mary and Martha in that story, there was a wait for their hope to be realized, wasn't there? Something like 4 days, I think, in that account. Our wait is longer than that. And sometimes pain in the waiting will feel almost unbearable. But I think a knowledge of that future hope changes everything now. It means that we can have the resources to be able to provide support, costly, sacrificial support to others who are in trouble or in need or in pain. That unshakable future, I think, frees us to be able to make those sorts of sacrifices for others. I think that's why, as you look at history, say times like this, of times of plague, you see Christians going against the normal culture. For example, a plague in the 2nd century, the normal Roman thing to do would be run for the hills. Well, Christians stayed and looked after people. Why? Because of that eternal hope. It makes all the difference now. And that's been true, I think, as I think about the suffering and pain that my friends have gone through recently, that I started with. It's really struck me the difference that hope has made. I think of my friend who held her newborn baby in her arms only for an hour, And in the face of that unbearable pain, she said to me that it didn't make her doubt the existence of God, and instead made her so glad for a God that cares for these frail little beings, walks with her in her suffering, and will one day unite her with him again. That isn't wishful thinking. That is seeing reality as it really is. Our why is best explained by there being a way things should be. That's what I've tried to say today, that I think our experience of pain, our asking why, shows us that there is a way things should be. I think that is best explained through a Christian worldview rather than an atheistic one. And I think our pain shines a light on the fact that our lives are meaning-drenched. And I think the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus makes all the difference in the world to our pain at the moment. These are huge things, I recognize. I'd love to hear your thoughts now, so we'll go to a time of Q&A. I'll invite Lily back up. I would just finish by saying these are such huge things that they are so important to consider, aren't they? That's why I think it's worth taking a week's holiday to talk about these sorts of things. I'd really love to invite you to keep considering these things. Take away that little John's Gospel that's on your seat. If you weren't close enough to one, then do ask for one. If these things are true, they're the most important things in the world, aren't they? So I'd really encourage you to keep exploring. And let's go to your questions now, because I do want to hear what your thoughts are. So Lily, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kaz. That was incredible. It is groundbreaking, isn't it? The idea of a God who not only cares, but fully understands, and then not only walks with us, but offers us that hope. Amazing. Yeah, we have some wonderful questions so far, guys. Do keep sending them in if any others pop into your mind, and we will get through as many as we can.
I'm getting my pen out because I start talking and I forget what people have asked, and I want to genuinely answer questions. So
That's good. That's great.
say it slow.
Okay, so how can we reconcile the amount of suffering in the world with the Bible's account of a loving God? Really great question.
How can we reconcile the amount of suffering in the world with the Bible's account of a loving God? I think that's essentially what I've tried to do there, is say that in that talk, is to say that I think that our experience of pain points to the idea that there is a God, not that there isn't. How can God then allow so much suffering in the world if he is also good and kind? That seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? And that's absolutely right. And it deserves probably a longer answer, probably a book, than I would be able to give now. But let me say one or two things that I think help me as I approach this question. The first is to say something about the way that God created us. That God created us in his image and made us as moral beings. So not a computer, not something that will kind of input, output, but moral beings. That's distinct from lots of other life that we see around us, isn't it? Animals, for example, we don't consider as moral beings. When one wrongs another one, we don't kind of put them in prison. We don't think there should be kind of retribution for that. Whereas humanity is moral, our experience speaks to that. That means that we have the capacity to love. We have the capacity to do good. Because God created us not to just do lots of things, but to love. He is love, and so he made us as beings who could love him, love each other. There's a word in our culture for enforced love. That phrase is a total oxymoron, isn't it? You don't enforce that. And so that means if we have that capacity to love, if we're moral beings and we have the capacity for good, then we do also have the capacity to do evil, to do wrong, to choose not to love. And that's what we have, I think, individually and corporately and historically, globally. That is what we've done. We've chosen not to love God, but to love ourselves. That's a Christian account of sin. that instead of loving God and loving him, we love ourselves. I think that's pretty uncontroversial, actually, the idea that we are all essentially selfish, that we have kind of messed things up, that we are all individually broken. I don't think that's massively controversial. And the Bible's account is that broken relationship between humanity and God is so huge that the kind of relationship between God and man is so core, it's knit so finely into the very fabric of existence that breaking it breaks everything. That we're living in a world that is totally broken, is out of kilter because that is broken. And so we experience all sorts of sufferings as a consequence of that, some of which are drawn directly from our own stupidness, and lots of which isn't things that we necessarily did wrong, but are the consequences of living in a world that is broken, that is out of kilter. And I think all of those things then, as I've described it, are consistent with the loving nature of God. He's a loving God who wants people who have the capacity to love, and that means that we have the capacity to do wrong. I don't think that those things are inconsistent with the character of God. The final thing then that I would say about this is, if you're someone who is not a Christian, particularly if you're someone who thinks that there isn't a God, you cannot say that suffering is morally wrong. You don't have to answer that question. You don't need to write that book or sit here and think through all those long things of how does this add up. In fact, your experience of suffering should be, well, it's just another day on earth. It's another day here where there is no why. And I think there are more problems with that way of viewing the world than with what I've just described, which I think is philosophically coherent, intellectually coherent and consistent, I think, that still has lots of questions, that doesn't tie everything up with a neat bow, dot the I's and cross the T's. There's still questions, but it is 1,000 times more satisfying, both intellectually but also emotionally, than any alternative. Thanks, Lily. Sorry for the length of that.
Brilliant.
Let's be concise in the next 5 minutes.
That's really good. Another question that I think ties in quite well with that is what you just said. Why is death our greatest enemy? Would our perception of death change if we considered or accepted it instead simply a part of life?
Yeah, it would change, wouldn't it, very much? And yeah, I think it's just interesting that in every culture, apart from in The Lion King, death is held as an utter tragedy. We show grief in lots of different ways, don't we? I find cultures where, grief is poured out loudly very appealing. I find that that seems right to me. In our culture, we deal with the tragedy of death very differently. We're more likely not to talk about it, actually. Find it very difficult to talk about, but that doesn't lessen the kind of size of it on our horizons, that it is something that is just enormous and is a huge tragedy. And so I would say that it's probably that kind of the idea that death is our greatest enemy, I don't think is unique to a Christian worldview. As you look around the world, one of the kind of key things about a culture is how we deal with this enormous tragedy. What do? We have all of these different rituals and things that we go through to deal with it. So yeah, we would look at death differently, wouldn't we? At an intellectual level, but at an experiential level, I think that belies the fact that it would be inhuman, I think, not to see death as the tragedy that it is.
Another really interesting question. How do you make sense of suffering caused by Christians or Christians who perpetrate pain?
Yeah, that is a great question, and another one that needs a book to answer it. What about suffering that is caused by Christians? because there has been, history is stained with things that people who claim to be Christians have done. Just to, in any conversation about Christianity, I think these things come up. Crusades, slavery, colonialism. Awful things that were done by people who claim to be Christians. And I think when we see that kind of hypocrisy, when we see that kind of distinction, we always have to ask, is that because of their beliefs, or is it in spite of them? Does Christianity mean that, as we look at it, as we look at the person of Jesus, does that kind of add weight to their behavior? Does it mean that they should behave like that, or is it in spite of those things that they've done that? And in the case of Christianity, it's absolutely in spite of. What those people needed was more Jesus. They needed to understand more of the Christian way of viewing the world. And I'm quite unpersuaded by the argument that those things are evidences that Christianity somehow doesn't work. This again would be a huge thing to discuss, but I think the kind of net contribution of Christianity, has it been bad or has it been good? I think it would be hard to say that it's been bad. My sister's not a Christian, she's a doctor. She's worked in various countries around the world, and one of her frustrations was that she found it hard to find hospitals that weren't set up by Christians. I think a number of different things like that where the kind of contribution of Christians is huge. That's not to belittle the wrong that's been done. And so I would say, is that because of or in spite of? The final thing that I would say on this is that you are holding Christians to their own standard, and that is good and right. If you're someone who's not a Christian, hypocrisy is a horrible thing to see, isn't it? So you should say, as a Christian, you're saying that suffering is wrong and you should seek to promote healing, seek peace, and all those sorts of things. So good, hold us to that standard. Again, the question I would ask is, where does your standard of moral goodness come from? I think you're inheriting a Christian standard even by asking the question. And so I suppose I would want to have a conversation with you about where your kind of morality comes from. And I think you see the outworking of, in the last century, we've seen the outworking of people, regimes who have sought to do away with God, perhaps on the understanding that it is bad for humanity, and that in the case of, millions of deaths in Soviet Russia, for example, that's not worked out particularly well. I said that was the final thing, so I will stop there.
Fab. Do we want to open up to the floor as well? Just if you have a question and you want to own your question, then feel free to put your hand up and shout it out. If not, we can keep going with the Slido. Make sure you shout really loudly. Thank you. Brilliant.
Say that very last sentence again. What reason do we have to leave it? Yeah. So if I've heard you right, I think what you've asked is the question. It lets us. I've said that Christianity lets us ask why, but that I've not answered why. Why does God allow that kind of? Why do we experience that kind of pain? And then the second part of your question, I think, is why doesn't He do something now to intervene in my pain? Is that right? Yeah, the pain that others experience as well. Yeah, excellent questions. Thank you. I think that kind of asks that question of exactly why is God allowing me to go through pain or suffering at the moment? That question. I think you're right. You've picked out exactly what I did in my talk, which is I said that Christianity lets us ask the question, why? Because there is a deviation. There is clearly in a Christian worldview, pain and suffering is a deviation from the way that things should be. So why is there pain and suffering? I tried to answer that in the first question, which is to say, I think that there is pain and suffering in the world essentially because we are living in rebellion against God. And that has, so in some, there will be things that are very obviously a consequence of my wrongdoing, suffering that I experience that is because of my wrongdoing, and we see that in the world around us, things that we can attribute to people who have taken the capacity that they have to love, because God made them as a moral being, and used it for wrong. So wars, genocide, lots of famine and food insecurity is down to human greed. So I think we can see that kind of suffering that comes from the way that God has made us as moral with people with the capacity for good and for love. Lots of it doesn't. Natural disasters don't, those sorts of things. Lots of the pain that we experience through illnesses are not a consequence of my own wrongdoing and those sorts of things. I think those things are an outworking of the fact that our relationship with God is so core to the whole universe that everything is out of kilter and broken because of it. Now, why doesn't he then... So that's where I think, that is why I think there is suffering in the world. Why doesn't he, if he can step in and do something about it, why doesn't he do it now? In one hand, I think the answer is that he has, in that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus does change the way that I experience pain and suffering now. I speak about that from personal experience, but also from the experience of my friends' lives, that knowing Jesus and knowing about his life, death, and resurrection gives them the resources to be able to deal with pain and suffering now, tangibly. But that he will one day make an end of all the sadness, of all the pain. And like you said, we have a desire for that. If he can do that, why isn't he doing that? We want that to happen right now. The final words of the Bible, I think, are "Come, Lord Jesus." Is that right? John, is that right? Come, Lord Jesus? It's near the end of the Bible. Come. And that's because we want it to end. We want the pain and the suffering to finish. We want it to be over. And Jesus has said that one day he will return and make the whole world new, where there is no more mourning, no more death, no more crying, no more pain. He said he's going to do that. Why doesn't he do it now? We want it to come now. Come, Lord Jesus. We want it to happen sooner. The Bible says because he's patient and because he wants more people to know his loving kindness. Because when Jesus comes back, there isn't an opportunity anymore to deal with our rebellion, the wrongdoing that I've done, the guilt that I have. The way that is dealt with, the only way that I can be welcomed in a new creation where there is no more mourning, no more sadness, no more crying, no more pain, is if my wrongdoing is dealt with, if my rebellion is dealt with. And that's why I spend holiday telling more people about that, because I want more people to experience that new creation. I want more people to know that loving kindness about Jesus. I think it's the most important thing in the world. And so if we want that world to come, if we want that to come, then we have to acknowledge that I don't deserve to be there. And so the only way that we can is, again, through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so why not now? Well, he will. And why not now? Because God wants more people to join in on that world where there is no more suffering. Yeah. So wouldn't it be easier for people to join in if it was more obvious, if there was better proof, essentially, that that was true? Yeah, make it provable. Yeah. Thank you. That is an excellent question. So if God really wants people to be in that new creation, then why doesn't he make himself more obvious? Yeah. I think to that I would simply say the fact that we are sitting 2,000 years after the life of Jesus thousands of miles away from where he lived, a carpenter from kind of random wee place in Palestine, that we are still talking about him in the University of Oxford 2,000 years later. I suppose I would say that I think he's done an all right job. That I think there is, there's not a lack of kind of discussion, belief in Christianity. Billions of people around the world and throughout history have found sufficient evidence that Jesus was the Son of God, that he did rise from the dead. And I think that that evidence is not coercive. I don't think it means that if you see it, you have to become a Christian, again, because I don't think enforced love is a good thing. But I think it is absolutely enough. And tomorrow, I'm going to lay out some of the reasons why I believe that the resurrection did happen. I think that the evidence is totally plentiful. And like I would say, I just find the premise of the question difficult because Christianity has the biggest belief system in the world. I don't think, it turns out that it wasn't such an arbitrary way that God revealed himself through a man in Palestine 2,000 years ago. Thank you.
Those were amazing questions. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Sadly, though, I'm going to draw that Q&A to a close. We had some incredible questions, and there were more on the Slido about morality, about Lazarus, about how we can come to God and cope through pain, right now in our suffering. Just brilliant questions. So please do keep those discussions open and ask people who you came with, or ask the stewards who are helpfully wearing lanyards and things. People will be around to chat. And Kaz, I know, is staying afterwards and is available after the talk, and very happy to have those conversations with you if you have any other questions that might have popped up from this session. So yeah, I would really encourage you to do that. And Known, obviously, is not over yet. We've got 3 more incredible talks to look forward to tonight and tomorrow. And I've got the names here to whet your appetites. So tonight we have a talk from Jonty on Imagine a World Where No One Felt Guilty. That's pretty incredible. And then tomorrow lunchtime, like Kaz mentioned, she'll be looking at the story of the resurrection, and the topic is, can our deepest desires be fulfilled? So really huge stuff, and I'm really excited to hear those. And Known, in a way, continues even beyond this week with an event that OICCU runs called The Search, and you're about to get a little promo video right now. So yeah, that's a little taster of The Search, but it's happening currently every Monday and Tuesday, both in person and online. And the structure is kind of a short talk followed by an entire hour to discuss these huge life questions. And it's really easy to get involved, actually, super fun. You just text the word search to 88802, and I think we'll have something that pops up on the screen in a moment. Oh, there it is. So yeah, just all you need to do is text search 88802, and this will just send you a link to the Facebook page, which you can join, and weekly text reminders of what the topics are and how to sign up if you're going along in person. And currently the setup is we're meeting in gardens in small groups with free Costa cakes, hot chocolates, marshmallows, fire pits. Just sounds like the most dreamy thing to me. And after the 17th of May, we should be back in Costa with free drinks and cakes there. So yeah, I would really encourage you to text and get involved, in case, you never know, one week a topic might just really spark your interest and you're like, you know what, I do fancy a free coffee and cake tonight, because, I mean, you're only human. But yeah, while you're doing that, just a huge thank you to the rest of the team. You guys are absolutely incredible on the tech team. Thank you so much for all your work. You're amazing. But that brings us to the end of the session. I'm so glad that you came, and please do keep these questions coming and keep those discussions open. And if you're on the live stream, why not hop onto a call, a Zoom call with a friend, if you're not already on one, and have these discussions as well. And please enjoy the free ice cream.